So today's lesson, we're going to go over something that everyone to an extent knows about, but not many people really explain in context what it is. And it's about the two trees that we see in the beginning of creation with humans, right? God put man, Adam, in front of two trees. What two trees? Do we know what the two trees are? Yes, Joy is correct. It's the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And these two trees represent not just to Adam and Eve the choice between life and death, but it is present for us today. And I think one of the most popular feelings whenever we read the story of Adam and Eve is, my goodness, how they messed up, right? Like, if I was in their case, I wouldn't even dare touch that tree. Well, that, and today, the tree is not a physical tree. And we will see that all of us are guilty of eating of that tree. We are not any different than Adam and Eve. And we will see that once we explain the spiritual significance of the two trees. And in reality, their significance in the Bible is a spiritual one. It is not a physical one. It wasn't so wrong that they just ate a fruit. Who cares? It's a fruit. Does it really matter that they ate a fruit? Or even that they ate a fruit that God said not to eat? Why would that force mankind into an age of doom and death? Haven't you ever thought of that? Why such a tragic consequence to such a very seemingly minor disobedience, right? Doesn't make sense. Well, that's because we don't understand what really happened that day. And for us to really understand God's purpose in our lives and in the lives of all people who have come after Adam and Eve, and the lives of the people who are living in the new age, the age of Christ, we must return to this and understand it, or else it won't make sense to us ever. So let us actually look at the verses that we see in Genesis. And the first is in Genesis 2:9. This is the first mention of the trees. It says, the Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So we see two distinct trees here in the middle of the garden. Two trees, complete opposite. The tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And later on in that chapter, the Lord God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die. His warning wasn't that if you eat from it, you will make me angry. His consequence, the consequence he brought up is that you will die. It is more significant than just disobeying God in this instance. It is that you will surely die. And that is more powerful, and it makes more sense why this consequence would be very big, and a huge reason why Adam and Eve are eventually kicked out of the garden and forced to live a life, in a sense, no longer in relationship with God. But we will explain that in more detail, so bear with me. And in Galatians 3:22, it says, the Lord God said, the man has now become like one of us. Oh, wait, I say Galatians? Sorry. Genesis 3:22. After Adam and Eve ate the fruit right? After they ate the fruit, God said, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not allow to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. After he consumed the, the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve, they were no longer allowed in the garden. Why? Because there they would have access to the tree of life. And the tree of life is the source of life. Meaning, if they were to eat that tree, they would by no means die. They would have lived forever. And what is that symbolic of? Yeah, do you know? What is the tree of life? Kind of. Yeah, kind of. Jesus. Jesus is the source of life, right? To partake of him, to eat of him, to consume him is to live forever. Everlasting life. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son, so that whoever may believe in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life, eternal life. And that means living forever and receiving within you the life of God forever. Once man partook of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, man became dead, no longer capable of eating of God even. So the only consequence of eating of the tree of life would not be having God in them. It would be living forever while being evil. That would be a disastrous consequence, right? For them to live forever while being evil. Thank goodness humans don't live forever. Because imagine all the evil they would do if they did. They'd be like little devils. And more importantly, that these two trees symbolize life and death. They are sources of life and death. And a verse in Psalms shows us that David is speaking about God. He's saying, you are the fountain of life. In your light, we see light, right? Jesus is likened to a fountain of life. He's likened a lot to a tree giving good shade and providing food and nourishment and rest, right? Solomon describes God as an apple tree that provides fruit and shade, and apple trees are nice trees. However, on the flip side, we see that in Hebrews here, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, Jesus, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death. That is the devil. So the devil is actually the power of death. It is through the devil that death and sin enter the world. It is not something God created. It is the absence of God. The devil is literally, the definition of the devil to us is the absence of God. It is a being that is everything but God. And so he is death, he is darkness, he is sin. And so let me blow your mind a bit. When they consumed the fruit of the tree of good and evil, they didn't just disobey God. A fruit, what is it? What is the purpose of a fruit? Well, it's to eat it for us. But why would the tree make fruit? Why would it go through all this effort to make something yummy just for somebody to eat it? Yeah, for reproductive purposes, right? For the seed, it's a reproductive part of the plant. The flower gets pollinated. The pollination creates a seed encased in a fruit being attractive for one to eat, an animal, a person, whatever, with the hopes that this seed will regenerate into more life. Well, just as Jesus was likened to one who regenerates our life. The devil is always the polar opposite of that. And so when man consumed the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they consumed the fruit of Satan. They consumed the reproductive power of Satan. And so the moment that man consumed the fruit of Satan, Satan entered into us. And he grew in us and became part of us, filling us with death and sin and corrupting us to the point where now we know we have the sinful nature. From the moment we are born, we are not innocent, maybe for a few years. But as soon as we are of age to start making our own decisions, our nature kicks in. When I was a kid, I stole things. I witnessed little kids steal and lie too. I'm like, my goodness, who teaches them? Nobody has to. It's in their nature. They just grow. They're born like this. The devil is inside us from the moment we are born. Do you realize that? He's within our body, within our mind even. And if we don't turn to the Lord, he can really grow in places where he can wreak destruction, not only in our lives, but in the lives of people around us. And so the most important decision we can make in the universe is the same decision that Adam and Eve had. To either take God as life, consume of the tree of life, or consume of the tree of death. And we can debate about many things, about what's the right thing to do in this instance, or how should I live my life, and whatever. But the most important decision we can make is this decision. Because they were both present in the greatest place God has ever created on earth, that is the Garden of Eden. And they were presented with everything possible, yet they made the choice that ruined them, not just out of disobedience, but out of receiving death, not life. And we may say, oh, well, I would have not done that. Well, we do that today. How many times have we chosen death over life in our existence? How many times have we chosen to eat of life, of the world, which only reaps death, while avoiding Christ, the tree of life? How many times do we come because the fruit of the world is appealing and tasty, and it promotes our lust? Oh, look at it, it's so great. And we grab it and we take it by only one bite. It's okay. And we find that the more we eat of it, the more we're dead inside. The more that we engage in the world, the more the death grows in us, to the point where we can be numb. We can no longer realize what we're doing. It has destroyed us from the inside out. It comes as something even innocent maybe, but it destroys us. The longer we're in the world, eating of the world and not of Christ, the more that the devil grows in us, the more that sin and death grows in us. And so we end up becoming one who is corrupted by death. And so the significance of Adam taking the fruit of the tree of knowledge was that he received Satan. And Satan is synonymous with death, right? We just said here that Jesus would break the might, that by his death he would break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil. There's no one else who holds the power of death other than the devil. Death was the devil's creation, or I wouldn't even say creation, but he twisted life, and out of it came death. And so we receive death into us. Hello, Paul. Welcome. So the moment that Adam and Eve ate of the fruit, They received Satan into themselves. They received death. Their bodies became bodies of death. And so not only did they receive it, but taking of the fruit of the tree of knowledge into themselves, they received Satan, and Satan grew in them. And so it just, the fruit. Sometimes people joke about swallowing a watermelon or eating a watermelon with the seeds, because the seeds will start to grow in you, right? It'll be like a tree or whatever it is, a plant in you. You're like, no, that's not going to happen, right? And of course it doesn't, because it gets digested, or it doesn't even digest. The seeds pass through fiber. And it needs some energy. It needs sunlight too, right? However, yeah, exactly. So that doesn't happen physically, but in the spiritual sense, this happened. Just as man, had they taken of the tree of life, they would have received life in their being. When they took of the other tree, they received a death that only grew. And to the point that, remember when Noah came around during that age, what did God say? He regret that he made man. Why? Because man became so evil. He became so evil. There was an evolution of evil within mankind that kept growing and getting worse and worse and worse, to the point where Satan really grew in mankind. His desire was to destroy what God created. The greatest thing God created was mankind, and his greatest intention, the devil, was to corrupt this thing. And he thought he succeeded. And for a long time in the Old Testament, it very much looked like the devil succeeded. He successfully corrupted mankind to the point where they lived evil, horrible lives. So much so that God had to wipe out the whole planet and only save Noah and his family. Imagine that. Imagine living in a world so evil that all existence had to be wiped out. That's incredible. Like the amount of corruption that humanity would have to be in for that to happen. I can only imagine. I mean, today we see how evil the world is. And even today is nothing compared to back then in that sense. Because now I could think of a handful of families and people that God would save, right? But back then, only one family in all the earth that was worth saving, because they followed God. One. Isn't that crazy? Look how much the devil was able to grow in us as humans. Yet God always has a plan. And I want us to also realize the significance, because it's not just they disobeyed God back then in the Garden of Eden. Something is living in them now, in mankind, that was once not there. Because when we look at Galatians 2:20, when we come to Christ, we see that I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. This is Paul stating this, not this Paul. But Paul, the apostle, stating this experientially, that because I have been crucified with Christ, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Christ is alive inside of him. It's real. And this is true of all who have given their life to Christ. Right? But just like as the devil also has a counterfeit to everything Christ has. Tree of life, the other tree. Just as we can have Christ living within us, so too did Paul say something very similar on the other spectrum. He said, "For I know that it is in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to. This I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it. The sin here is characteristic to a person, a being. Just as Christ is in me, living inside of me, giving me the strength to live the Christian life. Apart from Christ, what lives in me? Sin. Apart from Christ, sin lives in me. And sin is so powerful in this sense. It is so powerful in the flesh that even Paul, the greatest of all, claimed that I could not do the good that I wanted to do. I know what is good, yet I could not do it. Why? Because it is no longer I who do it, but the sin living in me that does it. There's something now in me that causes me to sin, that causes me to bring about evil. This is the sin nature that we received the moment Adam and Eve consumed of that fruit. It is beyond just disobedience. It is a partaking of death, partaking of sin, of the devil himself. What other source is there of sin? None. Is it from God? No. What other being could provide such a sinful nature? It is the devil. And again, let me show you this verse, Hebrews 2:14 again. It says here, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death. Who holds the power of death? That is the devil. There's no other who holds the power of death. And the corruption of our body is noted in the Bible many times. In Romans 6:6, it says, knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, with Jesus, that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin. So we are in slavery to sin, just as Jesus calls us to be slaves of Christ. The counterfeit for that is to be a slave of sin. We no longer do what we want. We're just in bondage to sin. It has power, authority over us. And it corrupts our body to the point where it is labeled as a body of sin. And in Romans 7:24, oh, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? It's a body of sin and also a body of death. Here, they're used almost interchangeably. It's not exactly interchangeable, but to the point where the sin in us is now death. There's no life. It's death. That is what sin does. Sin in itself, sure, we might disobey God, and God doesn't like that. But the greater consequence of what sin does is it leaves us dead. And how can God carry out his purpose in a dead being? He cannot. What did he have to do to Lazarus? He had to raise him up. Lazarus was dead. He had to raise Lazarus from the dead. This was in significance to our spiritual condition. We must be raised. We are rotting in a grave, dead. God cannot use a man who is asleep in death. God desires to be in his people as life. But here there's like this dilemma. And this is the dilemma that lasted for so long. Because remember this verse right here, Genesis 3:22, I just spoke about earlier. God said he must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take from the tree of life and eat it and live forever. No, he is no longer eligible to be taking of the tree of life. The moment we have death, you cannot partake of Christ. That is why the Old Testament, they were never able to be saved. As much as they had faith, salvation did not come to them until Jesus died. Why? Because the sinful nature still dwelled. Satan still dwelled within mankind. As much as they were tried to be fixed with laws and regulations and even to be called God's people in Israel, they still had the sinful nature. And actually, significance of this is, I'll say that later. I'm saving it for the end. But let's continue. Because the sinful nature also causes us to live it a different way. In Galatians 5:16 through 17, it says, I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. The two are not compatible. They're complete opposites. To live in the flesh is to not live in the Spirit. To live in the Spirit is to not live in the flesh. And the lust of the flesh is what comes along with this body of sin and death. It is our urge now as a human race is to fulfill the lust of the flesh. Whatever the flesh wants, I do. That is the same thing as being slave to sin. It's mentioned in the Bible many times in many ways to show us the extent. Sin, body, flesh. Flesh is the body corrupted by sin. Whatever it wants, I do. I have no power. Even Paul couldn't stop it. Right? And so the two are complete opposite. We could not no longer partake of the tree of life anymore. We either partake of it or we partake of death. The choice is still here today. But now we have the access through Christ. He restored that tree of life and actually became the tree of life. Who is the tree of life today? Jesus. John 15, he's likened to a vine, providing us with the nutrients to bear fruit. He said, you can do nothing of yourselves. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Apart from me, you are dead. Apart from me, you are a withering branch. You cut off. But with me, you can do all things. Through Christ, all things are possible. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That is the difference. Now we have the source of life. The devil desired to cut us off. He succeeded, but only for a time. And so now I hope we see that the fall of man was not just a matter of man committing something against God, but of man receiving Satan into his body. This is the bigger picture. The small picture is that, we disobey God, but is it so worthy that man would be cast out and living in darkness for centuries just because we ate a fruit we weren't supposed to? Or is there something more there that corrupted our whole being to the point where no longer could I serve God or even have the potential or capability to serve God? I think the Bible shows clearly that there's something in us that must be done away with. There's something in us that must be crucified. There's something in us that must be destroyed for us to return to a place where we can eat of the tree of life. And what better way than Jesus to do it himself? For that which the law could not do, and that it was weak through the flesh, God sending his own Son in the likeness of the flesh of sin, and concerning sin, condemned sin in the flesh. Somebody had to do it. Somebody who had the likeness of this sinful flesh, or this flesh of sin, which is more grammatically correct in this sense, because Jesus is not sinful. He only took the likeness of the flesh of sin. He did not take on sin, meaning he was not sinful. He took the likeness of sin, just like the bronze serpent in the time of Moses. He took on the likeness of Satan, meaning as a human filled with Satan, but he was not filled with Satan. The likeness of it. Symbolism. I want to get that point down because a lot of people think, oh, Jesus became sin. Well, kind of, but kind of not. He did not become sin. He never became a sinner, but he bore the sin. He took on the likeness of our flesh, which is full of sin. And he was crucified. He condemned sin in the flesh. He destroyed it. Because the thing the devil did not realize is he trapped himself within man. He trapped himself inside of mankind. And as much as he's trapped himself, he has to abide by the human flesh. Meaning the moment that Christ was crucified, he too was crucified. He was too made away with. He was trapped. That is the great victory. That is why Jesus said, it is finished. Death has been destroyed. Death and sin. Who is the power of death and sin? Hebrews 4:12 says the devil. The devil was destroyed. And I'm going to go back to it again because it says, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity. Who? Jesus. So that by his death, he might do what? Break the power of him who holds the power of death. That is the devil. He became a man to break the devil, to destroy the very body he came to corrupt, that he entered into to corrupt. It's a master plan that God intended despite the devil's corruption of humanity. God always wins. He always has the last punch or the last laugh, whatever you want to call it. And we'll explain that in more detail next week. I don't want to overwhelm you guys, but so I said stay tuned. The week after. So that was good.